Between the years 1500 and 1866, over 12 million African men, women, and children were torn from their homelands and forced across the Atlantic Ocean. But here's what they don't tell you in most history books. 2 million never made it across. They died in the darkness of ship holds, their bodies thrown into the ocean like cargo. This wasn't just theft. This was the systematic destruction of entire civilizations, the depopulation of kingdoms, the erasure of knowledge systems that had existed for millennia. But the story you're about to hear isn't just about suffering, it's about resistance. It's about how African people fought back, how they survived, how they preserved their humanity against impossible odds. This is the story they tried to bury. This is the Atlantic slave trade, and its consequences echo through Africa to this very day. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your narrator, and today we are confronting one of the darkest chapters in human history, but we are telling it from an African perspective. For too long, the story of the Atlantic slave trade has been told through European eyes. We hear about plantation economies, about shipping routes, about the profits made in Liverpool and Lisbon. But what about the kingdoms that were destroyed? What about the families torn apart? What about the demographic catastrophe that changed Africa's trajectory forever? Today's documentary will take you on a journey spanning 4 centuries. We'll walk through the magnificent kingdoms of West and Central Africa before European contact. We'll witness the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1440s and watch as a trickle of captives becomes a flood of humanity. We'll follow the stories of real African people, kings who resisted, warriors who fought back, captives who rebelled on slave ships, and communities that rebuilt themselves despite everything. But most importantly, we'll reveal the hidden truths. The African resistance movements that fought the trade for centuries, the economic systems that were deliberately destroyed, the demographic collapse that some regions still haven't recovered from 6 centuries later. By the end of this documentary, you understand not just what happened, but why it matters today, why some African nations struggle with development, why certain regions have gender imbalances, why cultural knowledge was lost, and why understanding this history is crucial for understanding modern Africa. This is not a story of victimhood. This is a story of resilience, resistance, and survival against the greatest crime in human history. Let's begin. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. In the 1400s, before European ships appeared on the Atlantic coast, Africa was home to some of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Mali Empire controlled the trans-Saharan gold trade. Timbuktu hosted one of the world's largest universities with over 25,000 students. The Sankore Mosque held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. Along the West African coast, the Kingdom of Benin had perfected bronze casting techniques that Europeans couldn't replicate. Their capital city, according to Dutch visitors, was larger and better organized than Amsterdam. The streets were wide and straight. The palace complex covered an area larger than many European cities. Further south, the Kingdom of Congo was a centralized state with a sophisticated administrative system. They had a written language, a currency system, and diplomatic relations stretching across Central Africa. On the East African coast, Swahili city-states like Kilwa and Mombasa traded with Arabia, India, and China. They used their own currency, built multi-story buildings from coral stone, and wrote poetry in Kiswahili. Africa's economy in the 15th century was diverse and interconnected. The trans-Saharan trade routes carried gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved people northward. But this slavery was fundamentally different from what was coming. In African societies, slavery was usually temporary. Enslaved people could own property, marry free people, and their children were often born free. It was a social status, not a permanent racial category. Many rose to positions of power, generals, advisors, even rulers. Most Africans weren't involved in slavery at all. They were farmers growing millet, yams, and rice, fishermen on rivers and coasts, metal workers crafting tools and weapons, weavers creating intricate textiles, traders moving goods across vast networks. The population was growing, cities were expanding, knowledge systems were developing. Africa was on its own historical trajectory until Europe arrived and changed everything. To understand why the Atlantic slave trade began, we must look at Europe in the 1400s. Portugal, a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, was obsessed with finding a sea route to Asia. They wanted to bypass the Muslim-controlled Mediterranean trade and access the spices, silks, and gold of the East. Starting in the 1420s, Portuguese sailors began exploring the West African coast. At first, they were looking for gold and a way around Africa to reach India. But in 1444, something changed. A Portuguese raiding party captured 12 Africans from the coast of Mauritania and brought them back to Portugal. Prince Henry the Navigator realized he'd found a new commodity. African captives could be sold in European markets. They could work on new sugar plantations being established on Atlantic islands like Madeira and São Tomé. This is crucial to understand. The demand for the enslaved labor came first from sugar. Sugar was like oil in our time, an incredibly valuable commodity that Europe craved. Growing sugar required intense labor in brutal conditions. European workers died in large numbers or simply refused to do it. The Portuguese tried enslaving Guanche people from the Canary Islands. They resisted too effectively. They tried the European convicts and poor people, not enough of them. They needed a large renewable source of labor from people who couldn't easily escape back home. They found it in Africa, and once the formula was established, manufactured goods shipped to Africa, enslaved people shipped to the Americas, sugar and other goods shipped back to Europe. The triangle of death was complete. But the Atlantic slave trade truly exploded after 1492, when Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors quickly enslaved indigenous peoples to work in mines and plantations. Within 50 years, over 90% of the indigenous population of the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America had died from European diseases, overwork, and violence. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and typhus. Entire civilizations collapsed. The Spanish and Portuguese still wanted their gold and silver from American mines. They still wanted sugar from Caribbean plantations. They needed to replace the indigenous workers who had died. They turned to Africa. This is the twisted logic of the Atlantic slave trade. One genocide created the demand for another. The demographic catastrophe in the Americas created a demographic catastrophe in Africa. And unlike the diseases that killed indigenous Americans, the slave trade would last for 400 years. By 1500, the stage was set for the greatest forced migration in human history. European powers, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, France, Denmark, Sweden, would build over 40 coastal forts along West Africa's coast. These weren't just trading posts, they were prisons, holding cells where captured Africans waited in dungeons before being loaded onto ships. The Atlantic slave trade would eventually drain captives from a vast region, from Senegambia in the northwest to Angola in the southwest, from the Bight of Benin to the Bight of Biafra, and from Central Africa's interior to the Atlantic coast. Over the next 366 years, This trade would remove at least 12.5 million people from Africa, and perhaps as many as 20 million when you count those who died during capture on the march to the coast or in the coastal prisons. The consequences would reshape Africa forever. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't run by one nation. It was an international operation with different European powers dominating different periods. Portugal pioneered the trade in the 1440s and controlled it for over a century. They established the first coastal forts, developed the ship designs, and created the brutal logistics of transporting human cargo across oceans. Britain became the dominant slave trading nation in the 18th century, transporting over 3 million Africans, more than any other country. British ships were so numerous that they developed a horrific efficiency, packing more people into less space to maximize profits. France, the Netherlands, Spain, Denmark, and Sweden all participated, competing for contracts to supply enslaved Africans to different American colonies. But these nations didn't simply raid African coasts and capture people themselves. That was too dangerous and too costly. They needed African partners. This is one of the most controversial and painful aspects of the slave trade. Some African rulers and merchants participated in capturing and selling other Africans. But context matters enormously. Let's be very clear. European demand created the market. Europeans provided the ships, set the prices, and controlled the ultimate destination. They introduced guns and gunpowder, which created military imbalances. They deliberately fostered conflicts between African states to ensure a steady supply of captives. Some African kingdoms, like Dahomey, became heavily involved in the slave trade. The kingdom of Dahomey captured people through military raids and sold them to European traders. Their economy became dependent on the trade. By the 18th century, they were exporting thousands of people annually. The Aro Confederacy in what's now Nigeria controlled a vast network of trade routes. They used religious authority and economic power to funnel captives to coastal markets. But these collaborators weren't representing Africa as a whole. They were individual kingdoms making decisions based on their own circumstances, often facing impossible choices between selling captives or becoming captives themselves. Far more African leaders resisted the slave trade than collaborated with it. These are the heroes whose stories must be told. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba fought Portuguese slave traders for over 30 years in the 17th century. She was a brilliant military strategist who built alliances, used guerrilla tactics, and provided sanctuary for escaped captives. At age 60, she personally led her troops into battle. The Kingdom of Benin initially engaged in the slave trade, but in the 1550s, the Oba king completely banned the export of enslaved people from his kingdom. For over 200 years, Benin refused to participate, protecting its population from the trade. The Kong Empire in what's now Ivory Coast actively fought against slave raiders and provided refuge for people fleeing the trade. They built fortified cities and maintained their independence well into the 19th century. Countless village chiefs and community leaders fought back, even when it cost them their lives. They hid people in forests, created forced trails to confuse raiders, and organized armed resistance against slavers. Let's remember that behind the statistics, 12.5 million people were individuals with names, families, dreams, and talents. Olaudah Equiano, captured as a child from the Kingdom of Benin in the 1750s, survived the Middle Passage, purchased his freedom, and wrote one of the first slave narratives. His book became a powerful weapon in the abolitionist movement. The majority of captives were young, between 15 and 35 years old. They were chosen for their strength, their reproductive capacity, their value as laborers. This wasn't random. It was a calculated demographic attack that removed the most productive members of African societies. Women made up about 1/3 of those transported. They faced additional horrors. Sexual violence was routine on slave ships and plantations, yet they also became the keepers of African culture in the Americas, passing down languages, religions, food traditions, and survival strategies. Children as young as 7 were captured and transported. Separated from their parents, they arrived in the Americas with nothing but fragmented memories of home. Yet somehow these children grew up to become parents themselves, preserving what they could of their African heritage. The men who physically transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic were often from poor European backgrounds themselves. They were sailors, criminals, or desperate men who took these jobs because they had few other options. But don't mistake their circumstances for innocence. These men whipped, raped, tortured, and murdered African captives. Disease killed about 20% of sailors on slave ships, but these men signed up voluntarily while their African cargo was there in chains. Some captains like John Newton eventually had spiritual conversions and became abolitionists. Newton wrote Amazing Grace after abandoning the slave trade, but for every repentant captain, dozens continued transporting human cargo until the trade's end. Those who survived the Atlantic crossing, about 10 million of the 12.5 million who left Africa, arrived transformed by trauma. They had survived starvation, disease, violence, and the suicide of friends and family members who threw themselves overboard rather than accept slavery. Yet these survivors became the ancestors of the entire African diaspora. They built communities, practiced their religions in secret, created new languages blending African and European tongues, and organized hundreds of rebellions. They were farmers from the rice-growing regions who taught Americans how to cultivate rice. They were metal workers who became skilled blacksmiths. They were musicians whose rhythms became jazz, blues, reggae, and hip-hop. They were spiritual leaders who blended African religions with Christianity to create new faith traditions. Finally, we must consider those who weren't captured but whose lives were destroyed nonetheless. Imagine a village that loses 50 of its young adults in a raid. The elderly and children remain. Who plants the crops? Who defends the village from the next raid? Who passes down knowledge and traditions? Entire regions became depopulated, villages merged for safety, agricultural systems collapsed, trade routes shifted, the social fabric was torn. These survivors, the parents who never saw their children again, the children who watched their parents dragged away in chains, the communities that lived in constant fear, they are characters in this story too. Their trauma, their choices, their survival strategies shaped Africa's future as much as the captives' experiences shaped the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade began not with a plan but with an opportunistic raid. In 1441, Portuguese captain Antão Gonçalves captured 12 Africans from the coast of Mauritania. He brought them to Portugal as curiosities for Prince Henry the Navigator, but Prince Henry saw an opportunity. In 1444, he organized a larger expedition. Portuguese raiders attacked villages along the Mauritanian and Senegalese coasts, capturing 235 people. They were sold in the market at Lagos, Portugal, the first recorded slave auction on European soil. For the first 50 years, the trade was relatively small. The Portuguese established trading relationships with African coastal kingdoms. They traded manufactured goods, cloth, metal tools, alcohol for gold, ivory, and small numbers of enslaved people. In the 1450s and 1460s, The Portuguese established sugar plantations on the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé. These became laboratories for plantation slavery, experiments in how to organize large-scale agricultural production using enslaved African labor. São Tomé, an uninhabited island of Central Africa's coast, became particularly important. Portuguese planters imported thousands of enslaved Africans to clear forests and plant sugar. By 1500, São Tomé was producing more sugar than anywhere else in the world. The system they developed, gang labor, brutal discipline, high mortality rates, constant replacement of dead workers with new captives. This became the model for Caribbean and Brazilian plantations. In 1483, Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River and made contact with the Kingdom of Congo. The Manikongo king, Nzinga Nkuwu, saw an opportunity for a mutually beneficial relationship. The Portuguese offered Christianity, literacy, technology, and trade goods. The Kingdom of Congo offered ivory, copper, and enslaved people captured in war. In 1509, Afonso I became Manikongo. He was a devout Christian who genuinely believed in partnership with Portugal. He sent his son to be educated in Lisbon. He invited Portuguese priests, teachers, and craftsmen to Congo. But by the 1520s, Afonso realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Portuguese traders weren't just buying war captives, they were corrupting Congolese nobles to kidnap free people, even members of the nobility. The slave trade was destabilizing his entire kingdom. In 1526, Afonso wrote a desperate letter to the King of Portugal. Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need from your kingdoms only priests and school teachers and no merchandise. Portugal ignored him. The profits were too great. The relationship between Congo and Portugal deteriorated into exploitation and eventual conquest. After 1492, as Spanish colonies expanded in the Caribbean and Central America, demand for enslaved workers exploded. The indigenous population was dying in massive numbers. Sugar plantations needed workers. In 1518, Spain granted the first asiento, an official contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. The trade began to industrialize. By 1600, approximately 400,000 Africans had been transported across the Atlantic. It sounds enormous, but it was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The 17th century saw the Atlantic slave trade transform from a Portuguese monopoly into an international competition. The Dutch, British, and French built their own coastal forts and began aggressively competing for African captives. In 1621, the Netherlands established the Dutch West India Company specifically to break Portuguese dominance in the slave trade. The Dutch captured Portuguese forts on Africa's Gold Coast, modern Ghana, and established their own trading posts. The Dutch were efficient and brutal. They introduced the practice of offering African kingdoms firearms in exchange for captives, a deal that sparked an arms race along the African coast. In the inland regions behind the coast, the kingdom of Dahomey began its transformation into a military state. Facing pressure from larger neighbors and seeing the wealth that could be gained from selling captives, Dahomey's rulers made a fateful choice. They built a professional army, including the famous Mino, female warriors who fought alongside male soldiers. They conducted annual military campaigns, raiding nearby peoples and marching captives to the coast. By the 1720s, Dahomey had conquered the coastal kingdom of Whydah and gained direct access to European traders. They became one of the primary suppliers of enslaved people, exporting over 10,000 people annually at the trade's peak. But this success came at a terrible cost. Dahome's economy became completely dependent on the slave trade, their society militarized, their neighbors lived in terror, and when European demand finally ended, Dahome's economy collapsed. Not every African kingdom chose collaboration. In the Portuguese colony of Angola, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo waged a 30-year war against Portuguese slave traders. Born around 1583, Nzinga initially served as a diplomat, negotiating with the Portuguese on behalf of her brother, the king. But when he died in 1624, she seized power and declared war on Portugal. Nzinga used brilliant military tactics. She formed alliances with the Dutch when they temporarily occupied Angola. She provided sanctuary for escaped enslaved people, integrating them into her army. She married and divorced strategically to build alliances with other kingdoms. She personally led troops into battle well into her 60s. When the Portuguese besieged her capital, she moved her court into the interior and conducted guerrilla warfare from fortified camps. Nzinga never surrendered. She maintained her kingdom's independence until her death in 1663 at age 80. The Portuguese only fully conquered Angola decades after her death. The real explosion of the Atlantic slave trade came with Caribbean sugar. In the 1640s, English colonists in Barbados, having failed to grow tobacco profitably, switched to sugar. They imported the plantation model from Brazil. Sugar production required enormous amounts of labor. The work was brutal, cutting cane in tropical heat, feeding cane into dangerous mills, boiling the juice in scalding vats. Workers died within a few years. The planters' solution was to import more enslaved Africans constantly. Barbados went from having a few thousand enslaved people in 1650 to over 40,000 by 1680. Jamaica followed the same pattern. The death rates on Caribbean plantations were so high that enslaved populations couldn't sustain themselves through natural reproduction. The only way to maintain labor forces was constant importation, which meant constant raids on Africa. By 1700, about 2.5 million Africans had been transported across the Atlantic. The rate was accelerating. The 18th century would be far worse. The 18th century was the Atlantic slave trade's deadliest period. About 6 million Africans were transported between 1700 and 1808, half of the entire trade's total in just over a century. Britain became the dominant slave trading nation. British ships transported over 3 million Africans, more than any other country. The cities of Liverpool, Bristol, and London grew wealthy on the trade. British slave ships became infamous for tight packing, cramming as many people as possible into holds. In one documented case, the ship Brooks was designed to hold 451 people in spaces 6 feet wide, 2.5 feet high, with each person having a space smaller than a coffin. The mortality rate on British ships averaged 15%, but on the most tightly packed ships, it reached 40% or higher. Captains considered this acceptable because even with heavy losses, the trade was enormously profitable. The Middle Passage, the Atlantic crossing, was a nightmare beyond imagination. Let's describe what captured Africans experienced. You've been marched for weeks from your village to the coast, chained at the neck in a line of 50 or 100 people. Many in your group have already died from exhaustion, disease, or despair. At the coast, you're imprisoned in a fort's dungeon, dark stone chambers where hundreds of people are packed together, waiting for a ship. The heat is unbearable. Disease spreads rapidly. You might wait here for months. Finally, European sailors drag you out, inspect you like livestock, and brand you with hot irons. You're loaded onto a ship, chained to a platform in the hold. You have about the space of a coffin. The ship rocks constantly. You're lying in your own waste and the waste of those chained beside you. The smell is so overwhelming that sailors on deck can smell it from hundreds of yards away. You're fed twice daily, beans, rice, or corn, barely enough to survive. Some people go mad. Some refuse to eat and are force-fed through funnel devices. Some die of disease, dysentery, smallpox, typhus. The dead are thrown overboard. Sharks learn to follow slave ships, feeding on the bodies. European sailors called them the business. The crossing takes 6 to 12 weeks depending on weather and route. About 15% die during the voyage. That's nearly 2 million people who never reached the Americas. But even this understates the horror because many survivors arrive so damaged by disease, starvation, and trauma that they die within weeks of landing. Yet enslaved Africans didn't accept their fate passively. Shipboard rebellions were constant and terrifying to European crews. Historians have documented over 500 shipboard rebellions during the Atlantic slave trade. The actual number was probably much higher. Rebellions usually happened when captives were brought on deck for exercise. Forced dancing that ship's captains believed kept them healthier. If guards got careless, captives would attack, trying to seize weapons and take control of the ship. Some rebellions succeeded. The most famous is the 1839 rebellion aboard the Amistad, where captives led by Sengbe Pierre, called Joseph Sinke, killed the captain and ordered the crew to sail back to Africa. The case eventually reached the US Supreme Court and the captives were freed. But for every successful rebellion, dozens failed. Crews were armed and captives were weak from starvation. Failed rebellions ended in massacres. Sometimes half the captives were killed as punishment. By the mid-18th century, the slave trade had fundamentally transformed African societies along the Atlantic coast and deep into the interior. Entire regions became specialized in capturing and selling people. The Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, Senegambia, Central Africa, each region developed its own dynamics of the trade. Warfare intensified across West and Central Africa. Kingdoms raided each other for captives. The introduction of European firearms created military imbalances. States that refused to participate in the trade found themselves raided by neighbors who did. Agricultural production declined in affected areas. Why plant crops for next year when raiders might capture you before harvest? Why invest in infrastructure when your entire village might be gone tomorrow? The population growth that had characterized 15th century Africa reversed in many regions. Some areas didn't recover their pre-slave trade population levels until the late 20th century. But by the 1780s, resistance was building in Europe itself. The Quakers, a Christian denomination, began organizing against the slave trade, arguing it was morally wrong. Olaudah Equiano published his slave narrative in 1789. His story put a human face on the trade and became a bestseller in Britain. Activists like Thomas Clarkson gathered evidence of the trade's horrors. William Wilberforce introduced abolition bills in Parliament repeatedly, facing fierce opposition from merchant interests. In the Americas, enslaved people themselves were creating the strongest argument against slavery through constant rebellions. The most successful rebellion occurred in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, France's wealthiest colony. In 1791, enslaved Africans launched a massive uprising led by Toussaint Louverture, a brilliant military strategist. For 13 years, Haitian revolutionaries fought French, British, and Spanish forces. They defeated professional European armies despite being outnumbered and outgunned.
In 1804, Haiti declared independence, the only nation founded by successful slave revolt. Their victory terrified slaveholders everywhere and inspired abolitionists worldwide. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, banning British participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The law took effect on January 1st, 1808. The United States banned the importation of enslaved people the same year, not from moral conviction, but from political compromise between northern and southern states. It went underground. Spanish and Portuguese ships continued transporting captives to Cuba and Brazil, where slavery remained legal. American ships flew foreign flags and smuggled people into southern ports. Britain established the West Africa Squadron, a naval patrol that intercepted illegal slaver ships off the African coast. Between 1808 and 1860, British ships captured over 1,600 slave ships and freed about 150,000 Africans. But this was a fraction of the continued trade. An estimated 2 million more Africans were transported illegally between 1808 and 1867. African coastal kingdoms that had depended on the slave trade economy faced economic collapse. Some transitioned to what Europeans called legitimate trade, exporting palm oil, timber, ivory, gold, and other products. But the transition was difficult and unequal. European merchants controlled prices and shipping. African producers received a fraction of the profits. The infrastructure built around the slave trade, cost of forts, trading networks, political alliances had distorted African economies in ways that couldn't be quickly undone. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended at different times in different places. Britain banned it in 1807, effective 1808. The United States banned importation in 1808. France banned it in 1815. Spain banned it in 1820, but continued illegally. Brazil banned it in 1850. Cuba, the last major destination, ended the trade in 1867. The last documented transatlantic slave voyage was in 1866, 422 years after the first one. Over those 4 centuries, at least 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships. About 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. Perhaps 2 million more died during capture and imprisonment before ever reaching ships. The demographic impact was catastrophic, the human cost incalculable. History books often describe enslaved Africans as unskilled laborers. This is completely false. Enslaved Africans brought sophisticated knowledge that built American economies. Rice cultivation enslaved people from rice-growing regions of West Africa, taught Americans how to cultivate rice in Carolina's coastal swamps. They designed the irrigation systems, built the canals, and developed the agricultural techniques. By the 1770s, Carolina rice made British merchants wealthy, all based on African knowledge. Metallurgy. West African iron-working traditions were often more advanced than European techniques. Enslaved blacksmiths were highly valued and often gained relative privileges. Architecture. Building techniques from Africa influenced American architecture, particularly in the South. African-style shotgun houses made to stay cool in hot climates became common. Medicine, African herbal knowledge saved lives. Enslaved healers treated diseases with plants and techniques unknown to European doctors. Onesimus, an enslaved man in Boston, taught Cotton Mather about inoculation against smallpox, a technique he'd learned in Africa. Culture. African rhythms became the foundation of jazz, blues, rock and roll, reggae, salsa, and hip-hop. African cooking techniques and ingredients transformed American and Caribbean cuisine. African storytelling traditions were preserved and evolved into new forms. The wealth of the Americas was built not just on African labor, but on African knowledge. About 1/3 of transported Africans were women, and their experiences carried additional horrors that histories often minimize. Rape was systematic. Ship captains and crew routinely sexually assaulted women during the Middle Passage. On plantations, enslaved women were subject to constant sexual violence from overseers and owners. Enslaved women faced impossible choices: bear children who would be enslaved, or resist pregnancy, knowing you might be sold away from existing children. Yet they built communities, raised children in horrible circumstances, and transmitted African culture. In Africa, the trade created gender imbalances, since captive labor forces in the Americas needed more men for heavy agricultural work. Slave traders preferentially captured men. Some West African coastal regions had ratios as extreme as 70 women for every 30 men. Women took on roles traditionally held by men: farming, trading, community leadership. Some historians argue this created stronger traditions of female authority in certain African societies, but it came at the cost of demographic disaster. While the Atlantic trade gets the most attention, we must acknowledge that enslavement existed in Africa before Europeans arrived and continued alongside the Atlantic trade. The trans-Saharan slave trade, run by Arab and North African merchants, had operated for centuries. It transported an estimated 9 million Africans from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East between 650 and 1900. The Indian Ocean slave trade, connecting East Africa with Arabia and India, transported another 4 million people between 800 and 1900. These trades were different from the Atlantic system in important ways. Slavery in Islamic and African societies was often less racialized. Enslaved people could convert and assimilate, and there was more possibility of freedom or social mobility. But suffering is suffering. Millions of Africans were enslaved, marched across deserts, and sold in Middle Eastern markets. Many died on the journey. The Atlantic trade was the largest and most destructive, but it wasn't the only one. The full story of African slavery is complex and painful. For over a century after the Atlantic slave trade ended, its history was deliberately obscured, minimized, and distorted. European and American historians wrote books describing slavery as benign, claiming enslaved people were happy, arguing they were better off than they would have been in Africa. They created elaborate racial theories to justify what had happened, claiming Africans were naturally inferior, suited for labor, incapable of civilization. These lies poisoned minds for generations. In Africa, colonial powers who had profited from the slave trade now claimed they were civilizing Africa. They destroyed or ignored evidence of Africa's sophisticated pre-colonial civilizations. African artifacts were stolen and locked in European museums. African history was dismissed as non-existent. The deliberate erasure of African achievement was an extension of the slave trade itself. Only in the mid-20th century, as colonialism ended and the civil rights movement gained strength, did historians begin seriously reconstructing the true history of the Atlantic slave trade and pre-colonial Africa. Modern genetic science has revealed hidden truths about the slave trade. DNA studies of African Americans show their ancestry comes from all along West and Central Africa's coast, reflecting the geographic spread of the trade. But DNA also reveals more painful truths: significant European ancestry in most African American populations, evidence of the systematic rape of enslaved women. DNA testing has allowed some descendants of enslaved people to trace their origins to specific African regions or ethnic groups. Families torn apart 400 years ago are discovering their connections. Economists have tried to calculate the monetary value stolen from Africa through the slave trade. The calculations are almost meaningless, because how do you price the value of a human life, of a destroyed civilization, of centuries of development that never happened? But even conservative estimates are staggering. Some historians calculate that the Atlantic slave trade extracted the equivalent of trillions of dollars in today's money from Africa in both labor and lost economic development. British profits from the slave trade helped finance the Industrial Revolution. American wealth, particularly in the South, was built on enslaved labor. Caribbean sugar made European merchants incredibly wealthy. Meanwhile, Africa was left depopulated, destabilized, and impoverished, setting the stage for the colonial conquest that followed immediately after the slave trade ended. The world we live in today, the wealth gaps between continents, the power imbalances, the lingering racism, all of this has roots in the Atlantic slave trade. Let's be clear about the numbers. Africa's population was growing before the Atlantic slave trade. Demographers estimate sub-Saharan Africa had about 50 million people in 1500. By 1850, after 3.5 centuries of slave trading, Africa's population was about 100 million. Sounds like growth, right? But if Africa had experienced the same population growth rate as the rest of the world during those centuries, it would have had over 200 million people by 1850. Africa lost over 100 million potential people, those who were taken, those who died in the process, and those who were never born because of the demographic collapse. Certain regions were hit harder. Angola lost an estimated 40% of its population. Parts of West Africa's coast were nearly depopulated. Some ethnic groups disappeared entirely. The gender imbalances created by preferentially capturing men meant population recovery was even slower. Fewer children were born. Social structures broke down. Some regions still haven't recovered. Parts of Central Africa have lower population densities today than they did in 1500. The Atlantic slave trade destroyed Africa's economic development in multiple ways. Selective removal of the productive population. The trade specifically targeted people in their prime working years, ages 15 to 35. These are the people who farm, innovate, build, have children, and drive economic growth. Imagine if every year the most productive workers in your country disappeared. What happens to your economy? Destruction of security. Constant raiding made long-term investments impossible. Why build a permanent house when you might be captured next year? Why clear new farmland? Why establish a workshop? The slave trade created a rational incentive for short-term thinking and insecurity. This killed economic development. Militarization, states that might have invested in education, agriculture, or trade infrastructure instead invested in weapons and armies. The arms race along the African coast absorbed resources that could have built schools, hospitals, and roads. Consider this. In 1500, West Africa and much of South Asia were at similar levels of development. Both had sophisticated kingdoms, extensive trade networks, advanced metallurgy, and growing economies. By 1850, India had been colonized, but was beginning to develop modern industries. West Africa was economically devastated, its population depleted, its political systems fractured. The Atlantic slave trade is the primary explanation for this divergence. Before the slave trade, Africa had large stable kingdoms: Mali, Songhai, Congo, Benin, Great Zimbabwe, and others. The slave trade destroyed these political structures. Large kingdoms broke into smaller warring states. Why? Because the slave trade rewarded militarization and conquest. Small, aggressive states could capture people from their neighbors and grow wealthy. Traditional alliances broke down. Trust between communities evaporated. After all, your neighbor might raid you for captives. Political legitimacy shifted from providing security and prosperity to providing protection from slave traders. This political fragmentation left Africa vulnerable to the colonial conquest that followed. When Europeans arrived in the late 1800s with colonial ambitions, they found African societies already weakened, divided, and traumatized by centuries of slave raiding. The borders drawn by colonial powers, famously done with rulers on maps in Berlin in 1884 to 85, often reflected the fragmented political landscape created by the slave trade. Knowledge systems disappeared. Master craftspeople were captured and sold away. Oral historians who preserved generations of history were lost. Universities like Timbuktu declined as scholars fled slave raiders. Artistic traditions were interrupted. Agricultural techniques were forgotten when the farmers who practiced them were taken. Some languages died out entirely when their last speakers were transported across the Atlantic or killed. Other languages survived but lost their writing systems or sophisticated vocabularies. The African diaspora in the Americas preserved fragments of African culture, but fragments only. They created magnificent new cultures, blending African traditions with European and indigenous American influences. But what was lost in Africa can never be recovered. How do you measure the psychological impact of 3.5 centuries of terror? Multiple generations of Africans grew up knowing that at any moment they might be captured and sold. The constant fear, the breakdown of trust, the trauma of watching family members dragged away in chains. This didn't just affect individuals. It affected entire societies. Modern psychology recognizes intergenerational trauma, how trauma experienced by one generation affects subsequent generations through parenting practices, community structures, and even genetic changes. African societies experienced trauma on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, and that trauma didn't end when the slave trade stopped. It was immediately followed by colonial conquest, which brought new forms of violence and exploitation. The psychological legacy of the slave trade and colonialism still shapes African societies today. The deep mistrust of outsiders, the difficulty building stable institutions, the patterns of violence, these aren't inherent to African people or culture. They are rational responses to centuries of exploitation and trauma. To justify the slave trade, European intellectuals created elaborate theories of racial hierarchy. They claimed Africans were naturally inferior, closer to animals than Europeans, incapable of civilization. These weren't just fringe ideas. They were taught in universities, published in scientific journals, used to justify slavery and later colonialism. Pseudoscientists measured skull sizes and claimed this proved European superiority. Philosophers and theologians debated whether Africans had souls. Biologists created racial classification systems with Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. These racist ideas poisoned Western thought for centuries. They inspired Nazi genocide. They justified apartheid. They underlie persistent racial discrimination worldwide. The Atlantic slave trade didn't just exploit African bodies. It created an ideology of racism that still damages societies today. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended in the 1860s. Immediately, and not coincidentally, European colonialism in Africa began. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 saw European powers divide Africa among themselves. Within 30 years, almost the entire continent was under European control. This wasn't random timing. The same infrastructure built for the slave trade, coastal forts, trade networks, alliances with some African rulers against others was repurposed for colonial conquest. The same racist ideologies that justified slavery now justified colonialism.
Europeans claimed they were civilizing Africa, bringing Christianity, education, and modern governance to supposedly backward people. But colonialism was just another form of exploitation. Europeans extracted Africa's resources, gold, diamonds, copper, rubber, palm oil, using forced labor that was slavery in all but name. Colonial rule lasted until the 1960s in most African countries, meaning that from the mid-1400s to the 1960s, over 500 years, Africa experienced continuous exploitation. First the slave trade, then colonialism. When African nations finally gained independence, they inherited borders drawn by colonial powers, economies structured to export raw materials, and institutions designed for extraction rather than development. To understand modern Africa's challenges, you must understand this history. Why do so many African nations struggle with weak institutions? Because centuries of slave raiding destroyed trust and prevented institutional development, followed by colonial rule that deliberately prevented Africans from gaining governance experience. Economic underdevelopment because the Atlantic slave trade extracted the most productive members of society for centuries, followed by colonial exploitation of resources. Political instability because the slave trade fragmented African political structures, and colonial powers drew borders that grouped hostile communities together or split ethnic groups apart. Conflict because centuries of slave raiding created patterns of militarization and violence and left deep ethnic tensions that colonial powers often deliberately inflamed. Brain drain because the Atlantic slave trade established a pattern of Africa's most talented people being taken elsewhere that continues through immigration today. None of this means Africa is hopeless. African nations have achieved remarkable things since independence, despite the legacy of slavery and colonialism. But understanding the historical context is crucial. The Atlantic slave trade didn't just affect Africa, it created the entire African diaspora. Over 140 million people of African descent live outside Africa today, mostly in the Americas. These diaspora communities have made enormous contributions: civil rights movements, revolutionary music and art, political leadership, scientific innovation, cultural transformation. But the diaspora also carries trauma. The descendants of enslaved people still face systemic racism, economic inequality, and the intergenerational effects of slavery. In recent decades, there's been a growing movement of reconnection. Diaspora Africans visiting ancestral homelands, DNA testing revealing specific origins, cultural exchanges, the concept of the African diaspora as a transnational community. This reconnection is part of healing from the slave trade's legacy, but it can never fully repair what was broken. So what do we learn from this terrible history? What is the message we must carry forward? First, the Atlantic slave trade was not inevitable. It was not natural. It was not the result of African inferiority or European superiority. It was a series of choices made by individuals and institutions over 400 years. Choices motivated by profit. Choices that treated human beings as commodities. Choices that required elaborate lies and self-deception to justify. Second, Africans never accepted slavery passively. This is crucial to remember. Every step of the way, from initial capture through the Middle Passage to plantation labor, Africans resisted. They fought back during raids. They rebelled on ships. They escaped from plantations. They preserved their cultures and passed them down through generations. They built new societies in the Americas. They organized abolition movements. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is not just a story of victimization. It's a story of resistance, resilience, and survival against impossible odds. Third, the consequences are still with us This isn't ancient history. The Atlantic slave trade ended just over 150 years ago. That's 2 or 3 human lifetimes. The racial ideologies created to justify slavery still poison societies. The economic patterns established by slavery still shape global inequality. The trauma experienced by enslaved people still affects their descendants. The demographic catastrophe in Africa still impacts development. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or creating guilt. It's about understanding the world we live in. Why is there a racial wealth gap in the Americas? Why do African nations face particular development challenges? Why does racism persist? The answers lie in large part in the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath. Fourth, human beings are capable of incredible evil and incredible good. The Atlantic slave trade shows humanity at its worst. The casual cruelty, the systematic dehumanization, the willingness to torture and kill for profit. But the same history shows humans at our best. The enslaved people who maintained their dignity and humanity. The abolitionists who fought for justice despite personal cost. The rebels who died fighting for freedom. The parents who passed down culture to their children despite everything. Both capacities exist in all of us. Understanding this history is part of choosing which capacity we'll nurture. Fifth, historical justice matters. Many people ask, why talk about slavery? It's over. We should move on. But the effects aren't over. You can't have centuries of exploitation and expect everything to be fine as soon as it officially ends. Genuine reconciliation requires acknowledgement. It requires truth-telling about what happened. It requires understanding how past injustices created present inequalities. That doesn't necessarily mean financial reparations, though reasonable people can debate that. But at minimum, it means education, memory, honest history. Finally, Africa's story is not defined by the slave trade. Yes, it was a catastrophe. Yes, its effects persist. But African history is so much more than this. It includes magnificent kingdoms and empires, scientific and mathematical innovations, rich philosophical and spiritual traditions, sophisticated art and music, political systems and governance structures that influence the world. The Atlantic slave trade interrupted African history, but it didn't erase it. And since independence, African nations have been rebuilding, developing, and reclaiming their place in the world. The story of Africa is ultimately one of resilience, and that resilience continues today. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the greatest crimes in human history. For over 4 centuries, millions of Africans were captured, transported in horrific conditions, and enslaved in the Americas. Millions more died in the process. The demographic, economic, political, and cultural consequences reshaped Africa and created the African diaspora. The racial ideologies created to justify slavery still poison societies worldwide. But this is not a story of helpless victimhood. It's a story of African resistance at every stage, of cultural preservation despite everything, of communities that survived and even thrived despite centuries of exploitation. If this documentary taught you something, if it made you think, if it helped you understand our world better, please hit that subscribe button. Africa Hidden History is committed to telling the stories that mainstream history ignores or distorts. Every week, we bring you new documentaries exploring African history from African perspectives, because Africa's story deserves to be told truthfully, completely, and with the depth it deserves. Next week, we'll be releasing a documentary on the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history and a direct response to the Atlantic slave trade. You won't want to miss it. Hit the like button if you found this documentary valuable. Share it with someone who needs to understand this history, and leave a comment
telling us what aspect of the Atlantic slave trade you'd like us to explore in more detail. Remember, African history is world history. The Atlantic slave trade shaped the modern world for both Africa and the diaspora. Understanding it is essential to understanding where we are and where we're going. So until next time, keep exploring the hidden stories of Africa. This is Africa Hidden History, signing off.